recipes and your gardening needs while sipping on Kentucky bourbon. You sit right back in your big red hat, we're taking rural back from the urban. Listen to the stories where Kentucky is proud, share the giggles with all of your friends. You all tuned in to Friends Drifting.
Good morning. It's Friends Drift In Breakfast Chat, episode 7. I'm Joyce.
I'm Charlie.
And we're here to talk about maple syrup in Appalachia. Can you believe that?
No, I tell you, it's something cool. We were talking to our friend Jamie Sword, and we got several friends that do this. Jamie's just one that lives closest to us. But it's a phenomenon here. Suddenly, we didn't know that you could get maple syrup from anything but a sugar maple tree.
Right, but you can get them from red maples and silver maples and sugar maples. And so here in eastern Kentucky, before the lockdowns,
yes,
we were really getting some momentum in the food industry, specialty foods. And maple syrup is one of those things we're really passionate about. We have several friends that are in the business. We know Keith Moore down at Savage Farms in Lawrence County. We also know Cheryl and Seth Long over in Letcher County, which is where we make our jam over at Whitesburg. And of course, Jamie Sword. Now we have a long background with Jamie. Jamie used to have a coffee shop right across from our office in town. And he's been a good friend, him and his wife, Michelle. They're very involved in the Pikeville Farmers Market. In addition to doing the maple syrup, she does specialty microgreens. Yes. And I mean, they're beautiful. They're just like rainbows of colors and just really amazing. Something that you might not expect to see in an Appalachian town down in the mountains, but certainly something that we're proud that they do. Now that maple syrup is starting to gain some momentum here in Kentucky, we do have a Kentucky Maple Syrup Association. And 2 years ago, I guess, was the first year that they were able to exhibit maple syrup at the state fair. And that was a big deal because Jamie scored very well in that.
He did.
Several blue ribbons and several red ribbons. Really proud of him for that.
Yeah, it was a great deal, and that's the thing, getting the word out about maple syrup here coming out of the mountains. The only thing about having maple syrup in the mountains is it's a little more expensive to make because we have a lower sugar content in our maple.
A little bit lower sugar content. So what that means is you have to pay more because like in Vermont, they have to pull off about 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of maple syrup. Well, here in the mountains, we've got to pull off about 60.
Or 80, depending on what
depending on the bricks and how it's going.
Of course, we're going to talk to Jamie in a minute. He'll explain a lot of that to you.
This is going to be a little bit different than what we usually do, but this is what we want to lean toward as the weather gets better. So Charlie is going to take a field trip out to Sweet Life Farm, which you can follow on Facebook. And do they have an Instagram account, Charlie?
I'm sure they do, but
I'm not positive. They probably do. Michelle is into that kind of thing, so I'm sure she does. So, Sweet Life Farm, Charlie's going to take a road trip and tell you all about making maple syrup here in the Appalachia. And I should mention that they just live right over the ridge from us, so they're like a really close neighbor.
Yes.
So, here we go. Charlie, take it away.
We're taking a drive up the driveway up to Jamie's collection site. You'll see the small tank over here to your right, and we'll get on up here to the main tank and we'll show you that. And you can see where the lines are coming into that big tank, the one with the beehive on it. Really nice setup he's got here, and that shows you, I don't know if you can see them hanging in the trees up there, but the lines coming into the main line to feed to this big tank. So that's where we get started at. So Jamie, what are we doing now?
We've come down to my main operation, the main sugar bush that I've got, to collect what sat flowed last night. I collected 40 gallons yesterday, but it was still flowing, so I figured before we boiled, I'd come down here and check to see if we had more. I've got, 3 years ago, I came down here on my cousin's property. On our left side here, it's kind of hard to tell with the camera, but you can see the small blue lines. Those are 3/16 what we call lateral lines going to the maple trees. I've got 50 taps on the left side, and I've got 100 taps up on the right side of the mountain. Now on this side, you'll see the big 3/4 inch, we call that a main line. And all the lateral lines will come down and they'll hook into the main line. And it all drains into this tank. This is kind of a new way of doing it. Sap runs down that line, it starts forming a hydraulic vacuum. And it'll actually pull up to 28 inch-pounds of vacuum on those lines.
Which is like siphoning gas out of a car, basically.
Yep, same feature. So these 150 taps down here on average, on a day, usually I'll get around anywhere from 50 to 75 gallons when it does flow. And sap, you know, I get tickled. People in the middle of summer say, "You making maple syrup today?" You know, sap doesn't flow in the maple tree for maple syrup until wintertime, when it gets down below freezing and then gets back up above and gets about 40 degrees during the day, and the barometric pressure will change, and it causes the root system to start pushing that sap up the tree. Now the sap will change its structure and the flavor will change in it when the red buds start popping out on the red maples. That lets you know season's coming to an end. So when I start seeing the red buds pop up on the red maples, I'll start walking my sugar bush and I start unplugging those trees when those buds come out. The sap gets a bitter taste to it then.
You have to pull the lines every year?
Yeah, every year I don't pull the lines down, I pull the taps out of the trees.
Okay.
And we've got a food grade cleaning solution. We run through the lines to clean them out and let them sit for the rest of the season
And
until
tap
next
them off,
season.
right.
Yeah, we tap them off to keep any kind of bacteria or any kind of contaminants from getting in them.
Well, tell everybody about the squirrel issue. I love that one.
Squirrels, yeah. Squirrels love these blue lines. They chew into them, I think out of curiosity at first. Well, then they figure out there's a sweet substance inside. So then they recognize the blue line, they'll start chewing holes. So you'll walk the sugar bush if you've got a flow going, or I've actually got a vacuum system hooked up on this line. When you're walking through your sugar bush, walking the lines, checking them, you'll hear you're like, daggone squirrels, and you know it there. Sure enough, there's a chew hole in the side of your line. So you have to take a fitting and clog it off, because that takes your vacuum away and you don't get the sap production like you normally would.
So I noticed you're using a vacuum pump to pull the sap
Yes.
out of the tank.
Yeah. Where I don't have maples on my farm, not a large enough number for me, I have to travel to do it. So I've got my side-by-side, and I put a tank on the back of the side-by-side and a little pump on here. And I've actually got 4 different tanks that I go and service. I've got another tank on this property down low, and then on my property I've got 2 tanks also. They're smaller tanks than this, but I've got another 50 taps on my property.
We're here now with Jamie Sword of Sweet Life Farms. And Jamie, let's talk a little bit about maple syrup here in the mountains of eastern Kentucky.
Yeah, you don't hear about it very often anymore. I've talked to people before that say the old timers used to talk about making maple syrup all the time, but it's something you don't hear about a lot anymore. Michelle and I, my wife, we were introduced to the Kentucky Maple Syrup Association 3 years ago, and we went from there, learned how to set our lines and what we needed to do to make maple syrup, and went ahead and ordered the equipment and the lines we needed, and I got up in the hills and started making it.
I'm gonna say, let's talk about the lines, because we do it differently here.
It's kind of, you hear talk about the lines and nobody knows what we're talking about. We start off, when we go in the hills, we look for our maple trees. We can use silvers, reds, sugar, maples, any of the maple trees you want to. Of course, your sugar maple is going to have the higher sugar content. Red maple is going to be another one that has a little bit better content, and then your silvers. Eastern Kentucky, the red maples are more prominent. We do have sugar maples here and some silvers, not many. But like on my farm, I'm probably 80% red maple to sugar and silver. When we find the trees, we mark them with just an orange tape, so it's easier to find once we start. And we take what's called a lateral line, which is this 3/16 line, and we run from tree to tree. With this lateral line, you can set up about 8 to 10 trees max, or taps, as you want to call it, is a max on per line on a 3/16. We put this little tap, it's called a spout. That little spout goes in the tree. And then we take this little stubby spout and it hooks into it, and it goes down this 3/16 line, which is called a lateral line. From that lateral line, it goes to a main line, which is a 3/4 or a 1 inch. I've got a 3/4 on mine. And the lateral lines will come in, tee into this main line, and then go down to a large collection tank so that we can collect the sap. You know, you watch any kind of shows or look up how maple syrup used to be made, you would see where they would take buckets and hang the bucket on each separate tree. Our demographic makes that a little bit tough. It'd be kind of hard to climb these hills,
Yes.
carry trees or the buckets of sap up and down the hills. You know, Vermont and places that are flat, I can see that being a lot easier. But even in Vermont, they use this tubing now. It's just, it's so much more economical.
I think the difference between us and Vermont is that with the elevation that we have where our trees are coming down to a bottom, then you can use natural gravity to
Yes.
suck that vacuum on
Yes,
us.
yes, we actually form a natural vacuum in this 3/16 line. And it'll pull 28 inch-pounds of vacuum. I mean, that's a good, strong
Yeah.
vacuum pull. And by forming that vacuum, you actually produce usually around 1/3 more sap than you would if you didn't produce a vacuum to help pull it out of that tree. They also make vacuum systems that'll hook up. You actually integrate them into these lines, and it forms a vacuum in the line and sucks that sap through the lines. It's not needed as badly here because of the hills, the elevation. The natural vacuum works perfect for us, actually.
One of the other differences between here and the northern states is we don't get as much cold weather, so we don't have as high a sugar content.
No, the cold weather makes the sugar content get higher in the trees. Vermont, you'll see, Michigan, areas up there, you'll see 2% sugar content really easy on your sap. Like this morning, we pulled our sap, and you know, we've had these winter storms, these ice storms, and temperatures have been down. I was at 1.4. It's pretty good reading.
Yeah.
I'm 1%, 1.5% here in eastern Kentucky. Now, what the difference in that makes is in Vermont, the 2% sugar content, they're going to boil 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup. Here in eastern Kentucky at 1.4, 1.5, you're going to boil about 60 gallons to 80 gallons to make a gallon of syrup. So we use more wood and more time to make our syrup
Right.
because we have to boil down more sap.
But you know, it's still maple syrup, and it's unusual to get something like that here. We talked about
It
that
is.
earlier. You know, it's only been commercial here in the last few years.
Yes.
People doing it to sell. Back in the old days, people just did it for their own personal use.
Yes, for personal use. Sometimes sugars, you know, they
Yeah.
boil that maple syrup all the way down to a sugar so that they had sugar. And, you know, we just don't do that anymore. You don't hear of it anymore.
So now we're getting ready to take the sap out of the tank and put it into the evaporator, right, Jamie?
Well, we've got a tank in the back
Okay.
that feeds the evaporator.
Oh, okay.
So I'm going to fill it up. And quarters are tight on
Yeah.
this little farm.
That's
so
all right.
what I had to do is my tank is in the back. There's no way to get the side-by-side to the back, so I had to run me a line through my sugar shack to the back so I can fill my tank.
That's what it takes. You gotta do what you gotta do.
You gotta do what you gotta do.
You know, that's living in the country right
Living the
there.
Appalachian way.
That's right. Make do with what you got.
Yep. So the sap will run this line.
Okay.
It's gonna run all through here.
I can hear it hitting the tank now. Of course, you got the tank elevated so that it will gravity feed back into the evaporator.
Tank's elevated up.
Okay.
Gravity feeds through this line over to what's called a float box on the other side of the evaporator.
Okay.
What this float box does is it regulates the level inside the evaporator. You know, you don't want to fill it 4 or 5 inches deep and boil because you don't get real good evaporation. It's hard to heat all of that liquid. So this one runs at about 3/4 of an inch of sap level so that you get that heat transfer a lot quicker. Now, these pans are set up, if you look underneath here, it'd be the easiest probably way to see it. You can see these little fingers sticking down,
Yeah.
what they call flues. Sap actually seeps down inside those flues. And what that allows for more surface area, again, for heat transfer.
Okay.
That is the back of the pan, which is called the boiling part of the pan. That's where your sap boils and starts condensing down the sugar. In the front of the pan, you'll have what's called your syrup pan. And that's where it's closer to the syrup level, and it boils it down into your syrup. Now, maple syrup is not maple syrup until it reaches 7 degrees above boiling. We were always taught in school that boiling point is 212 degrees. It's not true altogether. It's going to depend on your elevation and your barometric pressure.
We learned that from making jam over in Whitesburg.
Yeah, it makes a big difference. So what I have to do is every morning, right before I start to boil, I'll check my barometric pressure. I've got a weather station out here. I check my barometric pressure, and I've got a calculator, a little app on my phone, and I program all those numbers in, and it tells me what my draw-off temperature will be. On this one, I've got an automatic draw-off, and I set my temperature here. This is the temperature of the sap right now.
Okay.
Now you can tell it's a cold morning. It's 35 degrees. So that sap will raise and raise, and when it got to 217.3 degrees, this valve will open and let the syrup run out. Once it gets 1/10 of a degree below that, it closes. So it makes it a lot easier than trying to read an analog thermometer.
Oh yeah.
And open and close a little valve and crack it off all the time trying to get this sap out, because you don't know when it's maple syrup like that. You're always having to check it, use a hydrometer and check it. This is pretty fail-safe. I do have a hydrometer I use. I've got a digital refractometer actually that I'll use when it gets close to draw off, and I'll check it to make sure it's getting close to its 56 brick.
Yeah.
At 217 degrees, 56, 57 bricks is going to be your syrup.
And bricks is the sugar level.
That's your sugar content, which is about 1% per brick. They call it bricks or bond.
Yeah, right.
Brawn. It depends on the temperature. Like this is one of the Murphy cups that I use with the hydrometer in it. This one's set up to where it will actually show you by the temperature of the syrup where it should be to be syrup. Because the temperature is going to make a difference on your brick level also. So when syrup is at room temperature, it should be 66 bricks.
Okay.
When it's up to 217 degrees, actually in Vermont they rated I think 211 degrees. That's what they say the average is once it's drawn off, and in its bucket that it drew off into, it usually averages about 211 degrees. So they regulate it at that, and usually you're right at about 56 bricks at that temperature.
How long have they been making maple syrup? I know we've been making it for years in Appalachia, but it's only become commercial here in the last few years.
You know, growing up, I never heard anybody talk about making maple syrup here.
I've heard of a few, but really old people. Nobody our age.
Well, when I
guess
started
I'm
making
the old
it,
person now, though.
and when I started telling people I was making maple syrup, they're like, "Oh, I can remember my grandfather doing that. I used to help my grandfather do that." And I'm like, "Wow, I didn't know that." So years and years ago, yeah, they did do it here, but it just fell apart like most of the other old things did that happened around here.
Well, you know, this area really was a sustainable farming area, and then coal came in back in the early 1900s, late 1800s, and people went to work in the coal mines and everything, and they got away from subsistence farming.
Yes.
So they made their own sugar with maple syrup and maple candy and stuff, and then, you know, they made their own cornmeal and all that stuff.
They
and
did.
kind of we're going back a little bit and stuff like that.
We are. It's a shame, and we are. You know, the Indians, that's where we learned how to make maple syrup from, was the Indians. They would actually take big round river rocks, put in a fire. They would hollow a log out, look like a little miniature canoe. They'd pour the sap in that hollowed out log, throw those rocks in there, and it would boil its sap down to maple sugar. So that way they had sugar. And that's how we learned how to do it, was from them. And it's just evolved from there. So, you know, you get, like my evaporator here is just a little 2x3. You get up in Vermont, and those guys have got 6 foot by 18 foot evaporators. You know, they throw what I call whole trees. They just toss logs in, you know, where I'm just doing little pieces of wood. So depending on where
and we've talked about that, it's a little different here. We've got some different maple species, plus
yes.
we don't get as cold, so we don't get the amount of sap that they get either.
No, their sap content, the sugar content in their sap is higher. Where they get colder temperatures, their sap content will get up in that 2% range, where ours usually averages around 1 to 1.5. That being said, in Vermont, to make a gallon of maple syrup, they'll boil around 40 gallons of sap. Here, we usually end up doing about 60 to 80 gallons to make a gallon of syrup. So there's a lot of expense into making a gallon of syrup if you think about it, with the wood, the labor, all the parts, the tubing, and it takes a lot of money to get started. A lot of money and a lot of time.
Yes. Jamie, I notice you use a wood-fired evaporator here.
I do. This is a small evaporator. This is what they consider a hobbyist evaporator. It's a 2x3. You can get bigger. You get up into Vermont, the guys that got 10,000, 30,000 taps, you know, they'll use a 6 foot by 18 foot evaporator. This one, being a hobbyist, with my 150 taps that I've got, it works out perfect. You can get different grades depending on what you want to do with your farm. With this one, it's wood burning. They make gas burning also, but I don't have natural gas or gas here, and I didn't want to do that, so I went with the more old style, I guess. I just wanted the wood burning.
You know, let's talk a little bit about the temperature. We talked about the boiling point and all that.
Yeah. Syrup, maple syrup is considered maple syrup when it's 7 degrees above boiling point. You know, in school we was always taught boiling point's 212 degrees. Well, it's not. It's going to depend on your barometric pressure and your elevation. That plays a factor in that. So when I start boiling in the morning, I check my elevation. Well, I know my elevation. I check my barometric pressure, program that into a little app I've got on my phone, and it tells me what my draw-off temperature should be. From there, I'll go over to what's called an automatic draw-off. This measures the temperature of my syrup pan, and I'll set my temperature on the bottom to what it told me the draw-off should be. And when this top number reaches that bottom number, this automatic draw-off will open and let the syrup flow out. Once it gets just a 1/10 of a degree cooler, it'll shut that valve off to ensure that I'm only drawing syrup out here. Now we can check that with a hydrometer or refractometer if we need to, but every time I've ever checked it with this automatic draw-off, it's always perfect right at the bricks level it needs to be. Syrup, they rate it at a bricks level. I mentioned bricks there, and a lot of people probably don't know what bricks are.
Bricks is the sugar content, right?
It's your sugar content. It's basically almost 1% sugar for one brick, but they measure it by what they call bricks. In the old days, they would use a hydrometer and a Murphy's cup, which is what this is, and they would actually pour the syrup into this, float the hydrometer, and the hydrometer will give you a reading and let you know what your brick level is. You have to use what they call a compensation chart, because depending on the temperature of your syrup, the brick level reads different. So at room temperature, syrup will read 66 bricks, which is about 70 degrees, or 60 degrees, they consider it 66 bricks. At draw-off, the average for syrup once it's went into the pan from draw-off is 211 degrees. So at 211 degrees, it should be right at about 58 bricks, 56 to 58 bricks to be maple syrup. So we used this years ago. Now we use like auto draw-offs. We've got electronic refractometers. This is the one I use. It's electronic. I actually pour the syrup right into here, push a button, and it tells me my bricks level. It'll actually tell me the temperature of it also, so that I can read it.
And one thing about maple syrup is that once you put it in the jar, you don't have to do anything else to it. It's already shelf stable, right?
It's shelf stable, yes. Once you put it in a jar and seal it off, it basically cans itself because of the temperature that it draws off at. So, and I like doing that too. Like you'll notice my draw off, I use the quart jars or half-gallon jars, whatever I can get a hold of during COVID.
I understand that.
They're hard to find right now. It allows me to draw small amounts, cap it off. It's canned. I don't have to worry about it. It's shelf stable. I can put it up. Once the season is over, I'll take all my jars out and run them through a filtering system to clean that syrup up and get all the contaminants, what they call niter, your minerals and everything that boil into that, they settle in the bottom and form a sediment. So we filter that out so that you've got a nice clear product, and then we put it in the canner and we can it in the bottles.
Well, we're back at the Big Red Barn, and certainly I hope you've enjoyed the visit with Jamie Sword out at Sweet Life Farm, and consider the possibilities of Appalachia. The Kentucky Department of Agriculture says Appalachia proud, mountains of potential. And surely maple syrup is a potential.
It's about as mountain potential as you can get, and isn't it neat how that we get the natural gravity that pulls the vacuum, and you know, we have learned a lot ourselves, as well as Jamie and Michelle and all the other people here, when we got into the small food movement, about chemistry and physics and everything else. It's amazing how much of that stuff is really applied every day when you're making jam and maple syrup.
It is, and especially when you think about, you had it in college and high school, and that's been
A day or two ago.
on a planet far, far away. So we really appreciate you tuning in. Be sure to hit the subscribe button down below. Like us, tell your friends, share. In the comment section, tell us what you want us to record. What would you like us to do? Because it's certainly coming up on better weather.
What do you like that we're doing? What do you don't like that we're doing? We're willing to change. Hey,
we've got.
You can always buy us a cup of coffee to
Down
help pay the expenses of this. But we really enjoy it. We really enjoy living in Appalachia. I'm born and raised here in Appalachia. She's adopted it as her home as well after a couple of years of living up here with us.
Well, I've been here over 30 years, so almost half my life I've been in Appalachia. And of course, my family, that was a big surprise, but they were originally from Appalachia several generations back. It's a joy to live here. We talk about growing a good life in Appalachia, which is our tagline, and we're trying. We've had some setbacks and we've had some triumphs, and through it all, God holds us in our hand and we're blessed. So,
buy some jam. You can go to our website, friendsdriftin.com. We've got lots of different flavors of jam.
We just ran some strawberry rhubarb, and we've got strawberry moonshine, and we've got hot pepper jams that are just out of this world. And we grow a lot of that, and you're going to see that later in the summer as we get to good weather, where we can get out in our high tunnel and show you what it's all about. We thank you for stopping in. I'm Joyce.
I'm Charlie.
We're Friends Drift In. Have a good weekend.
All right, we're taking a drive up the driveway up to Jamie's collection site. You'll see the small tank over here to your right, and we'll get on up here to the main tank and we'll show you that. And you can see where the lines are coming into that big tank, the one with the beehive on it. Really nice setup he's got here, and that shows you, I don't know if you can see them hanging in the trees up there, but the lines coming